Imagine standing in the dim, cramped corridor of a submerged vessel, staring at a heavy metal door. You know with absolute certainty that the moment you turn the wheel and step inside, your body will begin to systematically shut down in the most agonizing way imaginable. Keeping that door closed is not an option. Walking away means a catastrophic explosion, one that could easily be misinterpreted as a deliberate act of war, triggering a global nuclear exchange. On July 4th, 1961, 300 feet deep in the North Atlantic, the crew of the Soviet submarine K-19 lived this reality. To understand how this crew ended up trapped in this nightmare, we have to look at the atmosphere of the late 1950s. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was so palpable that school children were routinely practicing duck and cover drills under their desks. Families across America were encouraged to build fortified fallout shelters right in their own homes. The threat of total annihilation was a daily reality for ordinary citizens. When the U.S. launched the USS George Washington, the world's first nuclear missile submarine capable of firing from underwater, the Soviet Navy panicked. They needed a direct response to this threat, and they needed it immediately. That response was Project 658, and its first vessel, the K-19. Driven by desperation to close the technological gap, Soviet engineers managed to construct their entire nuclear-powered ballistic submarine in a record-breaking 359 days. But that speed came at a severe cost. The top design bureau warned early on that the reactor's cooling system was unreliable, but those concerns were ignored. In the rush to launch, engineers failed to install a backup emergency cooling system. That single omission caught up with them on July 4, 1961. During a massive train mission, a tiny hidden microcrack in a pressure sensor tube burst. The starboard reactor's coolant leaked out, and the pressure abruptly dropped to zero. Without coolant flowing, the primary circulation pumps jammed. The frantic race to match American military might had placed a ticking time bomb deep in the middle of the ocean. This diagram shows exactly what happens when a reactor loses coolant. The core begins overheating instantly. On the K-19, temperatures quickly climbed past 400 degrees Celsius. Without intervention, a full meltdown and an explosion were imminent. The timing exacerbated the danger. It was the 4th of July, and the submarine was positioned between Iceland and Norway, deep in NATO-monitored waters. If the reactor blew, releasing massive amounts of radiation into the ocean, the American military would likely misinterpret the blast as a Soviet first strike, highly risking an immediate counterattack. Faced with this reality, Captain Nikolai Zaitayev calculated his options. Lacking any backup system, they would have to build one themselves by welding a makeshift bypass pipeline to flood the reactor with their own cold drinking water. The repair required the men to physically step inside the highly radioactive reactor compartment to access the broken coolant line. To prevent a nuclear disaster and a potential global war, the captain had to order his own crew into a radioactive furnace. Let's look at the scale of this hazard. This chart shows the lethal dose of whole-body radiation for a human, which sits at around 4 to 5 sieverts. The reactor room on the K-19 was pumping out 50 to 60 sieverts per hour. The crew had almost no defense. Equipped with nothing but standard gas masks and thin raincoats, they were completely exposed. To limit the damage, the captain organized the men in pairs, sending them in for frantic 5 to 10-minute shifts. Inside, the conditions were hellish. While fighting extreme heat and putting out small fires caused by hot electrical cables, the men blindly welded pipes from melted wires through thick, toxic smoke. The toll was immediate. The commander of the first team, 23-year-old Lieutenant Boris Korchilov, stumbled out of the compartment after just a few minutes, tearing off his gas mask to vomit. His skin was already blistered and bright red. Despite watching their crewmates collapse one by one, the successive teams of volunteers kept going. After several failed attempts, they successfully plumbed the ship's drinking water into the core, dropping the temperature and stopping the meltdown. But cold water hitting a superheated reactor produces steam. That highly radioactive steam was immediately sucked into the submarine's ventilation system, spreading through the air and exposing nearly all 139 men on board. The crew had secured the reactor and neutralized the threat of an explosion, but they were now sealed inside a highly contaminated steel tube. High-dose exposure to ionizing radiation triggers acute radiation syndrome, a biological breakdown that progresses in 3 brutal, inescapable phases. The first phase hits within minutes to hours. For the K-19 volunteers, their skin turned a dark, bruised red, developing severe swelling, peeling, and blistering. Within just 2 hours, the swelling in their faces was so severe their eyes were forced shut, making them unrecognizable. The true damage happens at a cellular level. The radiation destroys the bone marrow, stopping the body's ability to produce white and red blood cells. Without a functioning immune system and with platelet levels crashing, the men began suffering massive internal hemorrhaging, with some even sweating blood. With no antidotes available on board, the men were left to deteriorate. Barely able to speak, some could only lie in their bunks and whisper to their crewmates, begging for an end to their misery. Salvation finally came when a nearby diesel submarine received the K-19's backup SOS signal. Recognizing the severity of the crisis, the commander boldly violated radio silence orders to intercept them and evacuate the critically ill crew. Surviving the searing heat of the reactor room was a victory, but it merely locked the volunteers into a drawn-out, systematic biological collapse. 22 men died directly from the exposure. Boris Korchilov and the initial repair teams passed away within just days or weeks of the incident, while others succumbed over the next 2 years to organ failure and cancers. Instead of honoring their sacrifice, the Soviet government prioritized secrecy. They falsified the sailors' medical records, forced the survivors into 30-year non-disclosure agreements, and buried the highly radioactive bodies of the fallen secretly at night in zinc coffins. The bravery of the K-19 crew remained buried for decades. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s that the classified reports and the survivors' true medical histories were finally revealed to the public. Once the details came to light, the surviving crew began to receive the recognition they deserved. In 2006, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev officially nominated the entire crew for the Nobel Peace Prize. He stated clearly that their swift actions prevented a localized disaster that would have been far worse than the later tragedy at Chernobyl, as well as a potential global war. Ordinary sailors willingly walked into a lethal radioactive fire to prevent global annihilation, saving a world that wouldn't even know their names for 30 years.